Mr. Sterling, are you absolutely certain you don't want a real attorney? This isn't a game, young man. Judge Patricia Whitmore's voice cut through the Atlanta courtroom like ice as she stared down at the 18-year-old black teenager. Quincy Sterling stood trembling in his ill-fitting suit, clutching a worn legal pad. The packed gallery erupted in cruel laughter. Prosecutor Nathan Kingsley couldn't hide his smug grin, another easy victory against a kid who had no idea what he was walking into. But then something extraordinary happened. The trembling stopped. Quincy's shoulders straightened. When he lifted his head and looked directly at Judge Whitmore, there was something burning in his dark eyes that made her condescending smile freeze on her face. Your Honor, his voice was no longer nervous. It was calm, controlled, and absolutely terrifying. What I'm about to prove won't just destroy their case. It's going to expose how catastrophically this entire system failed. Dead silence filled the courtroom. Judge Whitmore's pen stopped mid-air. Prosecutor Kingsley's confidence evaporated like smoke, because everyone just realized they had underestimated exactly the wrong person. The courtroom was thick with tension. Judge Whitmore, a stern woman in her late 50s with a reputation for crushing young defendants, adjusted her glasses and peered down at Quincy with barely concealed disgust. Her lips curled into that familiar smirk she reserved for cases she considered wastes of her time. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "you've chosen to represent yourself in this case. Grand theft auto and resisting arrest are serious charges that carry up to 20 years in prison. Are you sure you don't want a real attorney? This isn't some television drama." Quincy looked exactly like what everyone in that room expected to see. A scrawny teenager whose hand-me-down suit hung loose on his thin frame, clearly out of his depth and about to be destroyed by a system designed to crush people who looked like him. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that made the gallery chuckle softly. But when Quincy spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that surprised everyone present. "Your Honor, I understand the gravity of the situation. I've reviewed the evidence thoroughly, and I'm confident in my ability to defend myself." Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Confidence is one thing, Mr. Sterling. Competence is another entirely. Let's see how far your self-taught legal skills take you against 20 years in a federal penitentiary." The prosecutor, Nathan Kingsley, stood up smoothly, his expensive suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to Quincy's humble appearance. "Your Honor, the state is ready to present its case. We have overwhelming evidence against the defendant, including eyewitness testimony and video footage. This should be straightforward." Quincy's heart raced, but he kept his face calm. He knew what was coming next. He had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment, studying every detail of the case, every legal precedent, every possible loophole. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting to expose the flaws in a system that had already written him off as another statistic. As Prosecutor Kingsley began shuffling through his mountain of evidence with theatrical confidence, Quincy's mind raced. He glanced at the jury, a mix of skeptical faces, some already looking bored, and then at Judge Whitmore, who was doodling on her notepad, clearly convinced this was going to be a quick conviction. They all thought this was over before it began. They thought he was just another young black man caught up in the system, destined to become another cautionary tale. But Quincy was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. The prosecutor's opening would be impressive, no doubt. The evidence would seem overwhelming. The witnesses would appear credible. But Quincy had discovered something that would tear their entire case apart, piece by piece. What happened next would change everything Judge Whitmore thought she knew about this case. Prosecutor Kingsley began his case with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case this straightforward. He strode to the center of the courtroom like he owned it, his voice booming with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a simple case about a young man who made a series of very bad decisions. On the night of March 15th, the defendant, Quincy Sterling, stole a vehicle and then resisted arrest when confronted by law enforcement." He gestured dramatically toward Quincy, who sat perfectly still, his dark eyes following every word with laser focus. "The evidence is overwhelming. We have eyewitness testimony from the arresting officer. We have video surveillance footage placing the defendant at the scene. We have physical evidence linking him to the crime. This isn't a mystery, Your Honor. It's an open and shut case." The jury nodded along, some already looking convinced. Judge Whitmore leaned back in her chair, clearly expecting this to wrap up quickly so she could move on to more important matters. But Quincy wasn't intimidated. While Kingsley spoke, he was taking meticulous notes, his pen moving across the legal pad with practiced precision. To anyone watching closely, there was something almost professional about the way he organized his thoughts, the way he seemed to catalogue every statement for future reference. "Your Honor," Kingsley continued, "the state calls our first witness, Officer Kent Bradford, the arresting officer." Officer Bradford took the stand, a burly man in his 40s with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had made hundreds of arrests. His uniform was pressed, his badge polished, his testimony rehearsed to perfection. "Officer Bradford," Kingsley began, "please describe what you observed on the night in question." "I received a call about a stolen vehicle matching the description of a black sedan," Bradford recounted, with mechanical precision. "When I arrived at the scene, I observed the defendant attempting to hot-wire the car. I approached him, identified myself as a police officer, and ordered him to stop. Instead, he fled on foot, leading to a brief chase before I was able to apprehend him." The testimony sounded airtight, professional, convincing. The jury was eating it up, their expressions growing more serious as they absorbed the officer's account. But Quincy was listening to something else entirely. His trained ear, trained through weeks of obsessive preparation, caught the subtle inconsistencies, the small details that didn't quite add up, the assumptions that had been made without proper investigation. When it was time for cross-examination, Judge Whitmore looked at Quincy with barely concealed amusement. "Mr. Sterling, do you have any questions for Officer Bradford?" The gallery held its breath. This was the moment where the young defendant would embarrass himself, stumble over legal procedures, and prove why he should have hired a real lawyer. Quincy stood up slowly. His nervous demeanor from earlier had completely disappeared. When he walked toward Officer Bradford, there was something different about his posture, confident, purposeful, dangerous. "Officer Bradford," Quincy began, his voice clear and controlled, "you testified that you saw me attempting to hotwire the car. Can you describe exactly what you observed?" Bradford shifted slightly, but answered confidently. "I saw you leaning into the driver's side window, holding what appeared to be a tool. You were fumbling with the wires." Quincy nodded thoughtfully. "And how far away were you when you made this observation?" "About 20 feet. 20 feet, Quincy repeated, letting the answer hang in the air. "In the dark. And you're certain you saw me holding a tool and fumbling with wires?" "Yes, that's correct." Quincy paused, his eyes scanning the jury. Some of them were starting to look curious rather than bored. Judge Whitmore had stopped doodling and was actually paying attention. "Officer Bradford, are you familiar with the interior layout of a 2019 Honda Accord?" Bradford frowned. I've seen plenty of vehicles." "That wasn't my question," Quincy said firmly. "Are you specifically familiar with where the ignition wires are located in a 2019 Honda Accord?" The prosecutor started to object, but Judge Whitmore held up her hand. She was intrigued now. "Answer the question, officer." Bradford's confidence wavered slightly. They're under the dashboard." "Exactly," Quincy said, his voice gaining strength. "They're inside the dashboard, behind the steering column, completely invisible from outside the vehicle." The courtroom began to buzz with murmurs. Quincy turned to face the jury directly. "So let me ask you this, Officer Bradford. How exactly did you see me fumbling with wires that are located inside a closed dashboard from 20 feet away, in the dark, through a closed window?" But the truth about Officer Bradford's testimony was even more shocking than anyone imagined. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Officer Bradford's face had gone pale, his confident demeanor cracking like ice under pressure. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, her earlier boredom replaced by sharp interest. "Officer Bradford," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "please answer Mr. Sterling's question." Bradford's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The jury was staring at him with growing suspicion, and even Prosecutor Kingsley looked concerned. I observed suspicious behavior," Bradford finally stammered. The defendant was clearly attempting to steal the vehicle. But Quincy wasn't finished. He moved closer to the witness stand, his young face set with determination that seemed far beyond his years. "Officer Bradford, let's talk about your identification procedures. You testified that you clearly identified yourself as a police officer before pursuing me, is that correct?" "Yes, that's standard procedure," Standard procedure, Quincy repeated. And were you in uniform at the time? Bradford hesitated. I was in plain clothes, undercover patrol. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Quincy's eyes lit up. This was exactly what he'd been hoping for. So you were in civilian clothes, approaching a teenager in the dark, and you claim you identified yourself as an officer. Did you show your badge? I believe I announced myself. You believe? Quincy's voice rose slightly. Officer Bradford, if someone in civilian clothes approached you aggressively in the dark without showing proper identification, what would your instinct be? Prosecutor Kingsley shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is asking the witness to speculate. But Judge Whitmore was fully engaged now. Overruled. Answer the question, officer. Bradford looked trapped. I would be concerned for my safety. Exactly, Quincy said, turning to the jury. Any reasonable person would be concerned for their safety. Any reasonable person might run from what appears to be a random attack by an unidentified individual. The transformation in the courtroom was remarkable. What had started as a slam-dunk case for the prosecution was beginning to crumble. The jury members were exchanging glances, their expressions shifting from certainty to doubt. But Quincy was just getting started. Officer Bradford, when you wrote your report about this incident, did you mention that you were in plain clothes? Bradford's lawyer training would have told him to be careful here, but he wasn't a lawyer. He was a cop who had made assumptions and was now watching them fall apart. The report focuses on the criminal activity. That's not what I asked, Quincy pressed. Did you specifically mention in your official report that you were not in uniform and did not properly identify yourself before pursuing a suspect? The silence stretched on. Bradford's face was now flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. No, he finally admitted. Quincy nodded slowly, then walked to the defense table and picked up a document. Officer Bradford, I have here a copy of your incident report. In it you state, and I quote, subject was observed committing auto theft and fled when approached by officer. Soaka, there's no mention of your attire, no mention of identification procedures, no mention of the physical impossibility of observing wire manipulation from your stated position. He handed the report to the court clerk. Your Honor, I'd like to submit this as Defense Exhibit A. Judge Whitmore accepted the document, her eyes scanning it quickly. Her expression grew more serious with each line she read. Officer Bradford, she said, this report seems to leave out several crucial details that have come to light in your testimony today. Bradford was sweating now. I focused on the essential facts. The essential facts, Quincy repeated. Officer Bradford, would you say that properly identifying yourself before pursuing a suspect is an essential fact? Yes, and would you say that being able to actually see the crime you're reporting is an essential fact? Yes, Then why are these essential facts missing from your report? The courtroom was electric with tension. Judge Whitmore was taking notes furiously. The jury was completely focused on this exchange. Even the court reporter seemed to be typing faster. Prosecutor Kingsley tried to salvage his witness. Your Honor, Officer Bradford has years of experience in law enforcement. His observations are trained and professional. But the damage was done. Quincy had systematically destroyed the credibility of the prosecution's key witness, using nothing but logic, attention to detail, and the officer's own words. No further questions, Quincy said, walking back to his table with the quiet confidence of someone who had just landed a devastating blow. As Officer Bradford stepped down from the witness stand, his face red with humiliation, the entire dynamic of the trial had shifted. The prosecution's slam-dunk case was starting to look more like a house of cards. Little did the prosecutor know that Quincy had discovered something that would turn their entire case upside down. Prosecutor Kingsley was visibly rattled, but he wasn't ready to concede defeat. Years of courtroom experience had taught him how to recover from unexpected setbacks. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and called his next witness with renewed determination. Your Honor, the state calls Mrs. Helen Thompson, the owner of the stolen vehicle. Mrs. Thompson took the stand, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a stern expression that made it clear she had no patience for criminals, especially young ones who looked like Quincy. She wore a conservative blue dress and clutched her purse tightly, as if afraid someone might steal it right there in the courtroom. Mrs. Thompson, Kingsley began, his confidence returning. "Please tell the court what happened on the night of March 15th. I parked my car outside my house that evening," she said, her voice tight with anger. "It's a nice neighborhood, or it was until people like him started prowling around." She shot a disgusted look at Quincy. "When I woke up the next morning, my car was gone, stolen. I called the police immediately." The jury nodded sympathetically. Here was a victim they could relate to, a hard-working woman whose property had been taken by a young criminal. "And when the police recovered your vehicle, was there any damage?" Kingsley asked. "Thankfully no, but that's not the point. The point is that he had no right to take what didn't belong to him. It was solid testimony, emotional, convincing, the kind that juries loved because it gave them someone to sympathize with and someone to blame." But Quincy had been listening carefully, taking notes, preparing for this exact moment. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he stood up with that same quiet confidence that had unnerved Officer Bradford. "Mrs. Thompson, you testified that your car was stolen. Did you personally witness anyone taking your vehicle?" "No, I was asleep, but when I woke up it was gone." "And when the police recovered your car, you said there was no damage? No broken windows, no forced locks, no signs of forced entry. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's right." Quincy paused, letting that sink in with the jury. "Mrs. Thompson, how does someone steal a car without leaving any signs of forced entry?" She looked confused. I don't know. Maybe they're just good at it. Or maybe," Quincy said, his voice growing stronger, "maybe the car wasn't stolen at all." Prosecutor Kingsley jumped up. "Objection. The defendant is arguing with the witness." "Sustained," Judge Whitmore said, but her tone suggested she was interested in where this was going. Quincy rephrased, "Mrs. Thompson, who has access to your car keys?" "Just me and my husband." "Just you and your husband," Quincy repeated. "And on the night in question, where were your car keys?" "In my purse, as always." "And where was your purse?" "In the kitchen." "And where was your husband?" "Mrs." Thompson's confident expression began to waver. He was home." "All night?" A long pause. "Well, I was asleep. I assume he was home." Quincy turned to Judge Whitmore. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my next witness, Mr. James Thompson, Mrs. Thompson's husband." The courtroom erupted. Prosecutor Kingsley shot to his feet. "Objection! This witness wasn't disclosed." "Your Honor," Quincy responded calmly, "Mr. Thompson's testimony is crucial to understanding the full context of this case. The prosecution has had ample opportunity to investigate all aspects of this alleged theft." Judge Whitmore considered for a moment. The irregularity bothered her, but the young man's methodical dismantling of the prosecution's case had captured her attention. "I'll allow it. Call your witness." James Thompson approached the stand reluctantly. He was a tall, nervous man who kept glancing at his wife, with an expression that could only be described as guilt. "Mr. Thompson," Quincy began, "do you own a black Honda Accord?" "Yes." "And do you have access to the keys to that vehicle?" "Yes." The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone could sense something big was coming. "Mr. Thompson, on the night of March 15th, did you lend your car to anyone?" James Thompson looked at his wife, then at the prosecutor, then back at Quincy. The weight of the moment was crushing him. I lent it to my nephew, Alex. He needed it for a date." The courtroom exploded. Mrs. Thompson's face went white. Judge Whitmore banged her gavel for order. The jury members were staring in shock. "So the car wasn't stolen," Quincy said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It was borrowed, with permission, from the legal owner." "Yes," James Thompson whispered. Quincy turned to face the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution is trying to convict me for grand theft auto based on a car that was never stolen. Their entire case is built on a false premise." Prosecutor Kingsley looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Judge Whitmore was shaking her head in disbelief. What they discovered next would destroy everything they believed about this case. The revelation that the car had been borrowed, not stolen, sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore called for a brief recess, during which Prosecutor Kingsley huddled desperately with his team, trying to salvage what remained of his case. When court resumed, Kingsley looked like a man fighting for his professional life. "Your Honor," he said, his voice strained, "while this new information is unexpected, it doesn't change the fundamental facts. The defendant was found in possession of a vehicle without the owner's knowledge or permission. Mrs. Thompson was unaware that her husband had lent the car, so from her perspective, it was still theft. It was a weak argument and everyone in the room knew it. But Kingsley had to try something. Judge Whitmore looked skeptical. "Mr. Kingsley, are you seriously arguing that a man can steal his own property?" "I'm arguing that the defendant had no way of knowing the car was borrowed. He acted with criminal intent." Quincy stood up, his confidence now radiating throughout the courtroom. "Your Honor, may I continue my examination of Mr. Thompson?" "Please do." Quincy turned back to James Thompson, who was still looking mortified at having torpedoed the prosecution's case. "Mr. Thompson, when you lent your car to your nephew Alex, did you give him permission to use it for the entire evening?" "Yes, he said he might be out late." "And did you inform the police that you had given permission for the car to be used when they told you it had been stolen?" James Thompson looked down at his hands. "No, I didn't think it was important. And I didn't want to get Alex in trouble. So when the police found me in your car, they had no idea that it had been legally borrowed by your nephew." "That's correct." The implications were staggering. The police had arrested Quincy for stealing a car that had never been stolen. They had built an entire case around a crime that never happened, but Quincy wasn't finished. "Mr. Thompson, where is your nephew Alex now?" He's in the gallery. He came to support his family." Quincy looked toward the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Alex Thompson as my next witness." A young man in his early 20s reluctantly stood up from the gallery. He was clearly nervous, but he made his way to the witness stand with resigned determination. "Alex," Quincy began gently, "you borrowed your uncle's car on the night of March 15th. What happened after your date?" Alex glanced nervously at his family. I parked the car near my apartment and went inside. But when I came back a couple hours later to return it, the car was gone." "Gone? What did you think had happened?" "I thought maybe it got towed or something. I didn't want to call my uncle because I was afraid I'd get in trouble for losing his car." "So you never reported it missing?" "No." Quincy turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, here's what actually happened that night. Alex legally borrowed the car from his uncle. He parked it and went inside. While it was sitting there, legitimately parked by its legal user, I happened to walk by and noticed the door was ajar." He began pacing, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I saw what appeared to be an abandoned vehicle, with the door open and keys in the ignition. I thought someone might be in trouble, so I approached to investigate. That's when Officer Bradford, in plain clothes without proper identification, came running toward me shouting." The story was coming together now, and it was nothing like what the prosecution had presented. "I had no idea who this man was. I thought I was about to be robbed or attacked, so I ran. That's not resisting arrest. That's self-defense against what appeared to be a random assault." Alex nodded from the witness stand. That's exactly what must have happened. I'm so sorry this got so messed up." Judge Whitmore was shaking her head in amazement. "Mr. Kingsley, did your office investigate any of these basic facts before filing charges?" Prosecutor Kingsley looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Your Honor, we relied on the police report and the victim's statement." "The victim's statement about a car that was never actually stolen," Judge Whitmore said dryly. The courtroom was buzzing with murmurs. The jury members were looking at Quincy with something approaching admiration. This wasn't just a legal defense. It was a masterclass in investigation and logical thinking. But even as the prosecution's case crumbled around them, Quincy knew he had more to reveal. The evidence of systematic failure ran deeper than just this one case. The truth was even more shocking than anyone imagined. If you believe young people like Quincy deserve to be heard and respected in our justice system, type respect below. Prosecutor Kingsley, now visibly sweating and desperate to salvage his case, played his final card. "Your Honor, regardless of the confusion about the car's legal status, we still have video evidence that places the defendant at the scene engaging in suspicious behavior. I'd like to call Detective Marcus Pemberton to present this crucial evidence." Detective Pemberton took the stand with the weary confidence of a 20-year veteran. He was a seasoned investigator who had testified in hundreds of cases, and his presence seemed to steady Kingsley's nerves. "Detective Pemberton," the prosecutor began, "did you review the security footage from the night in question?" "Yes, I did. We obtained surveillance video from a camera mounted on a nearby building that clearly shows the defendant's actions. And what did this video reveal? The footage shows a figure approaching the vehicle, opening the door and entering the car. The figure matches the defendant's description in terms of height, build, and clothing. It seemed like the prosecution finally had something concrete. The video evidence appeared to be their strongest remaining argument. "Detective," Kingsley continued, "in your professional opinion, does this video support the charges against Mr. Sterling?" "Absolutely. The video clearly shows someone attempting to gain unauthorized access to the vehicle. But when Quincy stood up for cross-examination, there was something almost predatory in his calm demeanor. He had been waiting for this moment. Detective Pemberton, you testified that the video shows a figure that matches my description. Can you describe what exactly is visible in this footage?" "The figure is approximately your height and build, wearing similar clothing." "Detective, does the video clearly show the person's face?" Pemberton hesitated for just a moment. "The footage is. The lighting conditions make facial identification difficult." "Difficult or impossible? The face is not clearly visible, no." Quincy nodded thoughtfully. "So this video that you claim proves my guilt doesn't actually show my face at all, is that correct?" "That's correct, but the physical characteristics—" "Detective Pemberton," Quincy interrupted, "how many figures are visible in this video?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Detective Pemberton's confident expression faltered. What do you mean?" "It's a simple question, Detective. When you analyzed this crucial piece of evidence, how many different people did you observe in the footage?" Pemberton looked toward Prosecutor Kingsley, who was staring at him with growing alarm. There are 2 figures visible in the video." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Whitmore leaned forward sharply. "2 figures?" she asked. "Mr. Kingsley, why wasn't this mentioned in your presentation of the evidence?" Quincy pressed his advantage. "Detective Pemberton, can you describe the physical differences between these 2 figures? One is noticeably taller and has a different build than the other." "Taller and different build," Quincy repeated. "And which figure does the prosecution claim is me?" Pemberton looked miserable. We focused on the second figure, the one that more closely matched your description." "You focused on the second figure," Quincy said, his voice rising with indignation. "Detective, did you investigate the identity of the first figure, the one who was taller and had a different build?" No, we did not. So you had video evidence of 2 different people near the vehicle, one of whom clearly could not have been me based on physical characteristics, and you chose to ignore that person entirely. The implications were devastating. The police had cherry-picked evidence, focusing only on what supported their predetermined conclusion while ignoring potentially exonerating information. Judge Whitmore was furious. "Detective Pemberton, are you telling this court that your investigation ignored half of the available evidence?" "Your Honor, we focused our resources on the suspect who matched the victim's description of the victim who didn't know her car had been legally borrowed by her nephew." Judge Whitmore's voice was sharp as a blade. Quincy turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when an investigation starts with a conclusion and works backward. They decided I was guilty and then looked for evidence to support that decision, ignoring anything that might prove my innocence." He gestured toward Detective Pemberton. "This detective admits that there were 2 people in the video, but they only investigated one. Why? Because investigating both might have revealed the truth, that the first person was Alex Thompson, legally using his uncle's car, and the second person was me, an innocent bystander trying to figure out why a car door was open." The jury was staring at Detective Pemberton with a mixture of shock and disgust. This wasn't just poor police work, it was a systematic failure of the justice system. "No further questions," Quincy said quietly. As Detective Pemberton left the witness stand, his reputation in ruins, the prosecution's case wasn't just crumbling, it was revealing the deep, structural problems in how the system treated people who looked like Quincy. That's when the real truth about the video evidence emerged. The courtroom was electric with tension as the full scope of the investigative failures became clear. Judge Whitmore was no longer trying to hide her disapproval of how this case had been handled. "Mr. Kingsley," she said, her voice cold, "does the prosecution have any additional evidence, or are you ready to rest your case?" Prosecutor Kingsley looked like a man drowning in deep water. His slam dunk case had become a public humiliation, but he had one more card to play. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Detective Pemberton back to the stand for redirect examination. It was a desperate move, but Kingsley had to try to rehabilitate his witness and salvage some credibility for his case. Detective Pemberton, Kingsley began, regardless of the number of figures in the video, the defendant was still found in a vehicle that didn't belong to him. Isn't that correct? Yes, that's correct. And he did flee from a police officer, correct? Yes. In your experience, don't innocent people typically cooperate with law enforcement rather than run? It was a reasonable point, and for a moment it seemed like Kingsley might be able to claw back some ground. But Quincy was ready for this too. When he stood up for recross-examination, there was something almost surgical about his precision. Detective Pemberton, in your 20 years of law enforcement experience, have you ever encountered situations where citizens were victimized by criminals impersonating police officers? Yes, unfortunately that does happen. And in those situations, what advice does the police department give to citizens about protecting themselves from fake officers? Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. We advise people to ask for proper identification, to request that the officer call for backup, and if they feel unsafe, to go to a public place or call 911. Excellent advice, Quincy said. Now, Detective, if a citizen is approached at night by someone in civilian clothes who doesn't show a badge, doesn't provide proper identification, and begins chasing them aggressively, would you say that citizen is following proper safety protocols by removing themselves from the situation? The trap was closing. Pemberton could see it coming but had no way to avoid it. If the person genuinely believed they were in danger from someone impersonating an officer, then yes, their safety would be the priority. Thank you, Detective. No further questions. As Pemberton stepped down for the final time, the damage was complete. The prosecution had not only failed to prove their case, they had inadvertently proven Quincy's innocence through their own witnesses. But Quincy wasn't finished. He had one more revelation that would expose the deepest problems in the system. Your Honor, I'd like to call one final witness before I rest my case. Judge Whitmore nodded. Proceed. I call myself to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom. Defendants testifying on their own behalf was always risky, but Quincy had demonstrated that he was far from a typical defendant. As he took the oath and sat in the witness chair, his transformation was complete. The nervous teenager from the beginning of the trial was gone, replaced by a confident young man who commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Quincy began, I want to tell you what really happened that night and, more importantly, what this case reveals about our justice system. He spoke clearly and confidently, his voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. On March 15th, I was walking home from my job at a local bookstore. I work there part-time to help my mother pay rent. As I walked past a residential street, I noticed a car with its door slightly open and the interior light on. The keys were in the ignition. He paused, making eye contact with several jury members. My first thought wasn't, here's something I can steal. My first thought was someone might be in trouble. Maybe someone had been hurt, or maybe it was an elderly person who had forgotten to close their door properly. So I approached the car to see if I could help. The jury was hanging on his every word. That's when I heard someone shouting behind me. I turned around and saw a man in civilian clothes running toward me aggressively. He didn't show a badge. He didn't properly identify himself as a police officer. He didn't follow any of the protocols that Detective Pemberton just described. Quincy's voice grew stronger as he continued. I'm an 18-year-old black man in Atlanta. I've grown up hearing stories about what happens to people who look like me when encounters with law enforcement go wrong. When I saw this unidentified man charging at me in the dark, my instinct wasn't criminal, it was survival. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Judge Whitmore was listening intently. So I ran. Not because I was guilty of anything, but because I was afraid. Afraid of becoming another statistic, another young black man whose life was destroyed by a misunderstanding that escalated out of control. He turned to face Judge Whitmore directly. Your Honor, this case isn't really about a car that was never stolen or an arrest that should never have happened. This case is about what happens when assumptions replace investigation, when prejudice replaces procedure, and when the system decides someone is guilty before they've even had a chance to speak. The power in his voice was undeniable now. I represent myself today not because I couldn't afford an attorney, but because I wanted to prove something. I wanted to prove that knowledge, preparation, and truth are more powerful than prejudice. I wanted to prove that a young black man from a poor family can stand in this courtroom and demand the same respect, the same presumption of innocence, and the same justice as anyone else. Several jury members were visibly moved. One woman was wiping her eyes. The prosecution's case has fallen apart, not because I'm some brilliant legal mind, but because it was built on assumptions from the very beginning. They assumed I was guilty because of how I looked. They assumed the car was stolen because a black teenager was near it. They assumed I was resisting arrest when I was actually trying to protect myself. He stood up from the witness chair, his voice reaching every corner of the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not asking for your sympathy. I'm asking for your justice. Because if this can happen to me, if an innocent person can be arrested, charged, and put on trial based on nothing but assumptions and sloppy police work, then it can happen to anyone. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Whitmore had to bang her gavel for order, but even she seemed moved by Quincy's words. "Thank you," Quincy said simply, and returned to his seat. Prosecutor Kingsley declined to cross-examine. What could he possibly ask that wouldn't make his case look even worse? "The defense rests, Your Honor," Quincy announced. Judge Whitmore looked at the prosecutor. "Mr. Kingsley, does the state wish to present any rebuttal?" Kingsley stood up slowly, his face pale. "No, Your Honor, the state rests." "Very well. We will break for lunch and then hear closing arguments. Court is adjourned until 2 p.m. As the gavel fell, the transformation in the courtroom was complete. Quincy had gone from being seen as just another young criminal to being recognized as a powerful advocate for justice. The system that had tried to crush him had instead revealed its own failures. What followed would destroy everything. When court resumed after lunch, the atmosphere was completely different. The gallery was packed with spectators who had heard about the extraordinary events unfolding in Judge Whitmore's courtroom. Local news reporters had gathered outside, and there was a sense that something historic was about to happen. Judge Whitmore called the court to order, her demeanor notably more respectful toward Quincy than it had been that morning. "We will now hear closing arguments. Mr. Kingsley, you may proceed." Prosecutor Kingsley stood up, knowing that his career might well depend on how he handled the next few minutes. His case had been systematically destroyed, but he had to try to salvage something from the wreckage. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice lacking its earlier confidence, "this case began with a simple premise. A young man was found in a car that didn't belong to him, and he ran when approached by law enforcement." He paused, looking at the jury with what he hoped was conviction. "Yes, there have been complications in the evidence. Yes, there were miscommunications about the car's status. But the fundamental facts remain. The defendant was in a vehicle without explicit permission from the owner, and he fled from a police officer. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the room knew it. Kingsley was essentially asking the jury to convict Quincy for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The state asks that you consider the evidence that has been presented and find the defendant guilty of the charges as filed." Kingsley sat down quickly, clearly eager to end his humiliation. Judge Whitmore turned to Quincy. "Mr. Sterling, you may present your closing argument." Quincy stood up slowly, his young face serious but determined. When he began to speak, his voice carried the weight of everything he had experienced, not just in this trial but in his life as a young black man in America. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, 3 days ago, I walked into this courtroom as a defendant. I was accused of crimes I didn't commit by a system that had already decided I was guilty before hearing a single word of evidence." He began to pace slowly in front of the jury box. "Over the past few hours, we've seen what happens when assumption replaces investigation. We've seen what happens when prejudice replaces procedure. We've seen what happens when the system fails to do its most basic job, seeking the truth." His voice grew stronger with each word. The prosecution's case wasn't just wrong, it was built on a foundation of negligence and bias. Officer Bradford couldn't have seen what he claimed to see. Detective Pemberton ignored evidence that didn't fit his predetermined conclusion. The victim reported a crime that never actually occurred. He stopped directly in front of the jury, making eye contact with each member. "But this case is about more than just my innocence. It's about what we demand from our justice system. Do we accept investigations that start with conclusions and work backward? Do we accept testimony that falls apart under basic scrutiny? Do we accept a system that treats young black men as guilty until proven innocent? The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to have stopped typing. I stand before you today not as a victim, but as a young man who refused to accept injustice. I educated myself. I prepared myself. I stood up for myself, because if I didn't, who would? He returned to his position behind the defense table. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence, the real evidence, not the assumptions and prejudices, proves that I am innocent of these charges. But more than that, it proves that when we demand better from our institutions, when we refuse to accept good enough as good enough, we can achieve real justice. His final words rang through the courtroom like a bell. I ask you not just to find me not guilty, but to send a message that our justice system must be held to the highest standards, that young people deserve respect, that black lives have value. That truth matters more than convenience. Thank you. The silence that followed was profound. Several jury members were visibly emotional. Judge Whitmore was looking at Quincy with what could only be described as respect. After a moment, she spoke. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard all the evidence and arguments in this case. You will now retire to deliberate and reach a verdict. Court is adjourned until you have reached a decision. As the jury filed out, Quincy sat down at the defense table, knowing he had done everything he could. He had not only defended himself, he had exposed the flaws in a system that needed to change. The consequences were just beginning. The jury deliberation lasted 3 hours, longer than anyone had expected for what had seemed like such a straightforward case that morning. As they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were serious but determined. But before the verdict could be read, Quincy stood up with one final request. Your Honor, before we hear from the jury, I'd like to recall Officer Kent Bradford to the stand. I have just a few more questions that are crucial to understanding the full scope of what happened that night. Judge Whitmore looked surprised. Mr. Sterling, your case is closed. The jury has deliberated. Your Honor, I believe the jury and the court deserve to hear the complete truth about Officer Bradford's conduct. It will only take a few minutes. Prosecutor Kingsley looked alarmed. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant can't recall witnesses after closing arguments. But Judge Whitmore was intrigued. Quincy's methodical approach had been flawless so far, and she sensed he had one final revelation. I'll allow it, but keep it brief, Mr. Sterling. Officer Bradford returned to the witness stand reluctantly, his earlier confidence completely gone. He looked like a man who knew he was about to face a reckoning. Officer Bradford, Quincy began, his voice calm but relentless. Earlier you testified that you properly identified yourself as a police officer before pursuing me. I want to give you one final opportunity to tell this court the complete truth about what happened that night. Bradford shifted uncomfortably. I followed proper procedure. Officer Bradford, are you familiar with your department's body camera policy? Bradford's face went pale. Yes. And were you wearing a body camera on the night in question? Yes, but, Officer Bradford, did you review the footage from your body camera before testifying in this court? The silence stretched on. Bradford looked toward Prosecutor Kingsley, who was staring at him with growing horror. Officer Bradford, Judge Whitmore interjected, please answer the question. The camera malfunctioned that night. Quincy pulled out a document. Officer Bradford, I have here a maintenance record from your department showing that your body camera was functioning properly and recorded the entire encounter. Would you like to revise your testimony? The courtroom was dead silent. Bradford looked trapped, cornered, desperate. I may have made some errors in my initial recollection of events. Officer Bradford, Quincy pressed, does the body camera footage show you properly identifying yourself as a police officer before pursuing me? Bradford's voice was barely a whisper. No. Does it show you displaying your badge or any other official identification? No. Does it show you following any of the protocols that you swore under oath that you followed? Bradford's head dropped. No. Quincy turned to face the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we have here an officer of the law who not only failed to follow basic procedures, but then came into this courtroom and lied under oath about his failures. He turned back to Bradford. Officer Bradford, in your sworn testimony, you stated that you saw me manipulating ignition wires from 20 feet away in the dark. Do you still maintain that testimony? I thought I saw... Officer Bradford, yes or no? Did you see me manipulating ignition wires? No. Did you see me commit any crime whatsoever? No. Did you have any legitimate reason to pursue me other than your assumptions about what a young black man might be doing near a car? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Bradford's face was red with shame and anger. I was trying to do my job. Your job, Quincy repeated, which includes lying under oath, ignoring evidence, and arresting innocent people based on racial profiling? Prosecutor Kingsley jumped up. Objection. Sustained, Judge Whitmore said, but her tone suggested she agreed with Quincy's characterization. Officer Bradford, Quincy continued, how many young black men have you arrested based on similar assumptions over the course of your career? I don't keep track. Would you say it's more than 10? More than 50? Bradford was sweating now. I arrest people who are breaking the law. Do you, Officer Bradford? Or do you arrest people who fit your preconceptions about who breaks the law? The officer stood up abruptly. I don't have to listen to this from some punk kid who... Sit down! Judge Whitmore's voice cracked like a whip. Officer Bradford, you will conduct yourself appropriately in my courtroom, or you will be held in contempt. Bradford sat down, his face flushed with humiliation. Quincy had made his point. He had not only proven his own innocence, he had exposed a pattern of misconduct that went far beyond this single case. No further questions, Your Honor. As Officer Bradford left the witness stand for the final time, his career and reputation in ruins, the courtroom understood that they had witnessed more than just a trial. They had witnessed a reckoning. What happened next would surprise everyone. Stories of courage and justice like Quincy's inspire people all around the world. Comment your country and city below, so we can celebrate our global community, standing up for what's right and fighting against discrimination wherever it exists. With Officer Bradford's credibility completely destroyed and the truth finally revealed, Judge Whitmore turned to the jury with a gravity that reflected the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged black man who had watched the proceedings with growing amazement, stood up slowly. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict. The foreman unfolded the paper with deliberate care, his voice strong and clear as he spoke. On the charge of grand theft auto, we find the defendant, Quincy Sterling, not guilty. A ripple of approval swept through the gallery. Quincy closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself to feel the relief, but he remained composed. On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant, Quincy Sterling, not guilty. This time the courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Whitmore banged her gavel, but she wasn't really trying to stop the celebration. She understood that this moment represented something much larger than a simple acquittal. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice carrying none of the condescension from that morning, you have been acquitted of all charges. You are free to go. But as Quincy stood to gather his papers, Judge Whitmore stopped him. Mr. Sterling, before you leave my courtroom, I need to say something. The room fell silent again. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses and looked directly at Quincy, her expression serious but respectful. In 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed a more thorough, more professional, or more devastating legal defense. What you accomplished here today was remarkable. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. But more than that, you forced this court, forced me, to confront some uncomfortable truths about how our system operates. You showed us what happens when we make assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence. You showed us what happens when we allow prejudice to masquerade as procedure. Her voice grew stronger, more certain. I came into this courtroom this morning seeing a young black man who I assumed was guilty, who I assumed was unprepared, who I assumed would be quickly convicted and forgotten. That assumption wasn't just wrong. It was a betrayal of everything this court is supposed to represent. The courtroom was absolutely silent. This was more than just a judge addressing a defendant. This was a human being, acknowledging her own failures and biases. Mr. Sterling, you didn't just prove your innocence today. You proved that when we demand excellence from our institutions, when we refuse to accept good enough as good enough, justice is possible. You proved that knowledge and preparation can overcome prejudice and assumption. She stood up, a gesture of respect that sent a powerful message throughout the courtroom. I don't know what your plans are for the future, but I hope you'll consider a career in law. Our profession needs people like you, People who refuse to accept injustice, people who have the courage to challenge the system even when it seems impossible. Quincy stood as well, his voice steady when he responded. "Thank you, Your Honor. What happened here today wasn't just about me. It was about every young person who's been prejudged, every person of color who's been assumed guilty, every individual who's been denied justice because they didn't fit someone's expectations." His words carried the weight of his experience and the hope of his generation. If this case proves anything, it's that the system can work, but only when we demand that it work. Only when we refuse to accept shortcuts, assumptions, and prejudices as substitutes for real justice. He looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of people who had watched his transformation from defendant to advocate. "I hope that everyone who was here today, everyone who witnessed what happened, will remember that change is possible, that justice is possible, but only if we have the courage to fight for it." The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt. Judge Whitmore allowed it to continue, understanding that this moment represented something historic, not just for Quincy, but for everyone who had witnessed the power of truth overcoming prejudice. As the applause finally died down, Judge Whitmore spoke one final time. "This court is adjourned." But even as people began to file out of the courtroom, there was a sense that what had happened here would resonate far beyond these walls. Quincy Sterling had not only won his freedom, he had won something much more valuable: respect, recognition, and the knowledge that one person with courage and preparation could change the world. The final impact would change everything forever. As the courtroom began to empty, Quincy was surrounded by people wanting to congratulate him, shake his hand, and express their amazement at what they had witnessed. But through the crowd, he spotted a familiar face that made his heart sink. Alex Thompson was standing near the back of the courtroom, looking mortified. Quincy made his way through the well-wishers and approached the young man who had inadvertently been the center of this entire case. "Alex," Quincy said gently, "I want you to know, none of this was your fault. You borrowed a car with permission. You didn't do anything wrong." Alex looked up with tears in his eyes. "But if I had just told the police the truth from the beginning, if I had called my uncle when the car went missing, none of this would have happened to you." Quincy put a hand on Alex's shoulder. "Alex, the system failed both of us. You were afraid to tell the truth because you thought you'd get in trouble. I was arrested because assumptions were made without investigation. But look what happened when the truth finally came out." "I'm so sorry," Alex said. "I can't believe you had to go through all of this because I was too scared to speak up." "Don't apologize," Quincy replied firmly. "Use this experience. Remember what happens when people make assumptions. Remember what happens when investigations are sloppy. Remember what happens when prejudice replaces procedure. And make sure it doesn't happen to the next person." Meanwhile, across the courtroom, Prosecutor Kingsley was packing up his files with the grim efficiency of a man whose career had just taken a devastating blow. The case that was supposed to be a simple conviction had become a public humiliation that would follow him for years. As he prepared to leave, he found himself face to face with Quincy. "Mr. Sterling," Kingsley said, his voice subdued, "I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this way." Quincy studied the prosecutor's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with professional embarrassment. "Mr. Kingsley, I don't think you're a bad person, but I think you got comfortable with a system that makes assumptions instead of seeking truth. Today was a reminder that we can do better." Kingsley nodded slowly. "You're right. And for what it's worth, you've given me a lot to think about regarding how my office handles cases like this." "I hope so," Quincy replied, "because there are a lot of young people who don't have the time and resources to spend weeks preparing a defense like I did. They deserve the same presumption of innocence that everyone else gets." As Kingsley walked away, Judge Whitmore approached Quincy. She had removed her robes and looked less like an intimidating authority figure and more like someone who had been profoundly affected by the day's events. "Mr. Sterling, I meant what I said about law school. Have you given any thought to your future?" Quincy smiled for the first time all day. "Your Honor, 3 days ago I was working part-time at a bookstore and helping my mother pay rent. I never imagined I'd be standing in a courtroom having this conversation." "Well, you're having it now," she said. "And I have some connections at several excellent law schools. If you're interested, I'd be happy to make some calls." I would appreciate that very much, Your Honor. Judge Whitmore reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Call my chambers tomorrow. We'll talk about your options. As she walked away, Quincy looked around the now mostly empty courtroom. The place that had seemed so intimidating that morning now felt like a battlefield where justice had actually won. His mother, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery throughout the trial, finally approached him. She was crying, but they were tears of pride rather than fear. "Quincy," she said, embracing her son, "I always knew you were special. But what you did today, I don't have words. Mum, I did what you taught me to do. You always said that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing right. You said that knowledge was power, and that no one could take it away from me once I had it." She held him tighter. "I'm so proud of you, baby. So proud." As they walked out of the courthouse together, past the reporters and cameras that had gathered to cover the story, Quincy reflected on how much had changed in a single day. He had walked into that courtroom as a defendant, accused of crimes he didn't commit. He was walking out as something entirely different, an advocate, a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to accept injustice. But more than that, he was walking out with a future that looked completely different from the one he had imagined just hours before. What happened next would surprise everyone about the power of truth. 6 months later, the impact of what happened in Judge Whitmore's courtroom was still reverberating throughout Atlanta's legal community and beyond. Officer Kent Bradford had been suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct, not just in Quincy's case but in dozens of others where his testimony was now being questioned. The body camera footage that he had tried to hide revealed a pattern of unprofessional behavior that could no longer be ignored. Detective Marcus Pemberton had been reassigned to desk duty while the department reviewed his investigative methods. The revelation that he had ignored crucial evidence in the video footage had prompted a broader examination of how cases were being handled. Prosecutor Nathan Kingsley had implemented new protocols in his office requiring more thorough investigation before filing charges, especially in cases involving young defendants. The public humiliation of Quincy's trial had forced him to confront the shortcuts and assumptions that had become routine in his practice. But the most significant change was in Judge Patricia Whitmore herself. She had begun requiring prosecutors to provide more comprehensive evidence before allowing cases to proceed. She had instituted mandatory reviews of all cases involving defendants who chose to represent themselves. And she had become an advocate for legal education programs that would give young people the tools to understand their rights. Most importantly, she had become a mentor to Quincy Sterling. Quincy was now a first-year student at Emory University School of Law, his tuition covered by a scholarship that Judge Whitmore had helped him secure. His story had spread far beyond Atlanta, inspiring young people across the country and attracting the attention of civil rights organizations and legal aid societies. But despite all the attention and opportunities, Quincy hadn't forgotten where he came from or why he had fought so hard in that courtroom. Every weekend he returned to his old neighborhood to run a legal clinic for young people who found themselves in trouble with the law. He taught them their rights, helped them understand legal procedures, and most importantly, showed them that the system could work if they had the knowledge and courage to make it work. "The law isn't magic," he would tell them. "It's a tool, and like any tool, it's only as good as the person using it. But if you take the time to learn how to use it properly, it can be incredibly powerful." On this particular Saturday morning, Quincy was preparing for another session when he received an unexpected visitor. Alex Thompson, now working as a community organizer, had come to volunteer at the clinic. "I wanted to help," Alex said simply. "What happened to you happened because I was too scared to tell the truth. I can't change that, but I can make sure other people don't make the same mistake." Quincy smiled and handed Alex a stack of legal pamphlets. "Welcome to the team." As the morning progressed, young people from the neighborhood began arriving for the clinic. They came with stories that were heartbreakingly familiar, encounters with police that had escalated unnecessarily, charges that seemed disproportionate to the alleged crimes, public defenders who barely had time to learn their names. But they also came with something new: hope. "If Quincy could do it," one teenager said, "maybe we can too." That afternoon, as Quincy was packing up the clinic materials, his phone rang. It was Judge Whitmore. "Quincy," she said, "I have some news that I think you'll want to hear. The Georgia Bar Association wants to present you with an award for your contributions to legal advocacy and community service. Quincy was quiet for a moment. Your Honor, I appreciate the recognition, but that's not why I do this work. I know that, she replied. That's exactly why you deserve the award. But there's something else. They want you to speak at the State Bar Convention about your experience and what it means for the future of legal practice. What should I talk about? Judge Whitmore's voice was warm with affection and respect. Talk about what you've always talked about, Quincy. Talk about truth. Talk about justice. Talk about what happens when we refuse to accept good enough as good enough. As Quincy hung up the phone, he looked around the community center where he ran his legal clinic. The walls were covered with thank you notes from young people whose lives had been changed by understanding their rights, by learning that they had power, by discovering that the system could work for them if they knew how to make it work. This was his legacy, not just the dramatic courtroom victory that had made headlines, but the quiet, steady work of empowering others to demand justice for themselves. Because Quincy Sterling had learned something that day in Judge Whitmore's courtroom that went beyond legal strategy or courtroom tactics. He had learned that change was possible, but only if someone was willing to fight for it. And he had learned that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one that everyone underestimates. Thank you to everyone who typed respect, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support for justice and equality means everything. If stories of young people overcoming systemic barriers inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage triumphing over prejudice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth and the strength that comes from never giving up.